Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. So, vibrant matter, Jane Bennett. That's the topic of this video, and this is going to be just a single video. We will look at what Bennett has to say in this book. I'm not going to go through in kind of a chapter by chapter breakdown the way I normally do. This one's just going to be a much more big picture kind of take. I'm just going to talk about what I think her goal is in the book, how she goes about trying to achieve that goal, and some of the mistakes, the problems that I think she has in the kind of line of reasoning that she takes. So it is going to be a little bit critical, actually. I didn't find a lot that I actually enjoyed in the book. I got it kind of expecting something quite different. When I read Harman's object-oriented ontology, he talks about Bennett, but he talks about her as not as someone kind of fully aligned with his views and the way that some of the other people he talks about in the book are. So that was kind of one of the things that appealed to me, actually, because when I finished object-oriented ontology, I didn't really like it that much. I wasn't really on board with it. So he mentioned Bennett as kind of being in the same vein, but not someone that he sees himself as kind of, or not someone he sees as working in the same, heading completely in the same direction as him. So that was positive. And also she talks about Bergson. So Henri Bergson, that's always, anyone who's picking up from where Bergson left off is okay in my book. But yeah, she did not deliver on that at all for me. So anyway, we'll see. We'll see how this plays out as we go, but this is just going to be a single video. And yeah, so with that said, let's jump into the first section, which is the goal of the book. So the goal of the book, of Bennett's book here, is it's political, actually. And I wasn't fully expecting that. I guess on the back it actually says political ecology. So if I'd looked a bit closer, I might have been less surprised. But yeah, it's a political. She has political goals, and what I gathered from reading the book, the overarching goal is, and this is a quote, to find a more horizontal representation of the relation between human and non-human actants. So she doesn't say that that's the goal explicitly, but at least I don't remember coming out and just saying it, but that's definitely what the whole point of the book is. That's the goal of Vibrant Matter. She wants to lower the gap between human and non-human influences. So, in effect, reconceive animals, plants, and even inanimate life, minerals. She has a section about metal. So even minerals and inanimate objects as bona fide members in all processes or events. And so with that goal in mind, it basically plays out in two ways. First, we diminish or play down the difference between humans and non-human animals. Okay, so that difference becomes a difference in degree, not a difference in kind. Very much not Bergsonian at all. Bergson's the complete opposite of that. And then there's a second kind of step, which is playing down the difference between the living and the inanimate. So again, the difference is more a difference in degree, not a difference in kind. And so when we kind of erase those differences through those two different categories, amongst those two different classes of things, of objects, then we get to this goal, that the ultimate goal, a more horizontal representation of the relation between human and non-human actants. Okay, so the whole book, there are essentially two movements that Bennett uses to try and achieve this goal. And that's going to be the subject of the next section. So these two movements, they don't match back to the two ways I identified before at the end of the last section, about playing down the difference between humans and other animals, and then between living and inanimate objects. It's we're kind of taking those two steps as one in this. In what I identify here as the two movements that Bennett uses to kind of secure, or try to secure, her goal. And the way I'll analyze these movements in this section, similar to what I did with Harman's object-oriented ontology, I'll give you the movement, and then because with all of these people, there's always a reasonable kernel of truth behind what they're saying. You know, there is a reasonable interpretation here on offer, and often that will be where you would go if you were trying to defend Bennett. You'll go to the kernel of truth that's there in the claim, but that's not really the claim that Bennett's making. She really wants to make what I call the unreasonable claim, and that's the stronger, the less plausible of the two. But that's what she's really pushing. So it's always there's almost like room for a bait and switch here. You can set up with the reasonable and then slide to the unreasonable, and if anyone criticizes or objects, you've got that recourse back to the reasonable. Well, this is all I'm saying. That's nothing too outrageous. Reasonable defense, but there is that constant slide to, or leaning in the direction of the unreasonable. So we'll look at the reasonable, the kernel of truth, then the unreasonable, and then I'll give a short discussion about the claim. So the first movement is an elevating of objects in the direction of agency. So we're trying to move objects from inanimate, passive things to a more active role, to seeing them more as agents. That's the first movement. And this comes under what Bennett calls distributive agency. An interesting term that could have merit in the right circumstance, but that here is really just trying to secure this goal of taking agency away from humans and replacing it with, or locating it not in the human, but in this wider group. So distributive agency, what does it mean? Instead of, as I said, locating agency in one of the objects involved in any event or process, i.e. the human, we're saying that the agency arises from the interaction of all of these different objects, the human, the non-human. There is no agency in any one of these particular things, but the agency arises from the interaction. It's distributed amongst all of the actors in any situation. So that's what she means by distributive agency, and the goal is this first movement, to elevate objects, to give them to bring them into this ambit of agency, to include them in our understanding of agency, to make them agents themselves. So the reasonable kernel of truth here is that all events have non-human participants, of course, right? Humans don't do anything on their own. We use things, we use inanimate objects, we use other animals, we bring all of these things together. All events, all processes are a mixture of human and non-human participants. Definitely, that's obviously true. It's completely reasonable. We couldn't, in fact, we can even go further and say we couldn't do anything without non-human objects. They're necessary for anything to happen. And Bennett goes there. She talks about worms, how essential they are for human life as we know it. Without worms, we couldn't, our lives may not even be possible. May not be possible for us to carry on living, let alone doing the things that we think make us agents. So that's the reasonable, that's the kernel of truth. Yes, all events have non-human participants, and these non-human participants are essential. But the unreasonable element to this claim is to then go a step further and say, therefore, these non-human participants, which are so essential, are active. They are bona fide members with a kind of agency. The agency of assemblages. And that's another word that Bennett uses to try and nudge non-human participants into the sphere of agency. So an assemblage is it's just distributive agency again. It's the idea that nothing happens on its own. Nothing happens through the act of a single object, of a single actor or agent. It's always a result of a collection, a group, an assemblage. And so that's the unreasonable claim that follows on from the reasonable. Therefore, we ought to accord these non-human participants with some kind of agency. So by way of a discussion of some of this, how this plays out in the book, Bennett talks about, she has a section about electricity choosing its own path from point A to point B. Apparently this is a thing. When you can generate the electricity at a power station and send it through the grid to different places, but there are always multiple routes the electricity can take, and that is going the exact route that any that the electricity will take is to some extent unpredictable. And sometimes it will take a route that we didn't intend or that we didn't expect. And so Bennett uses the word choosing here as if the electricity is choosing its own path, as if it were an actual agent. And this is just anthropomorphism, right? It's just taking human attributes and attributing them to inanimate objects. Electricity is not choosing its path, but this is one of the ways she works to elevate objects in the direction of agents. Another way she talks about it is chips, potato chips. She says that she talks about them inviting us to eat them. So we're not the sole agents here. We're not the sole choosers. We're not the only people. We're not the only important objects in this. The chips themselves have a role to play when we eat them. They are actively inviting us. Again, anthropomorphism, right? And this actually has a reasonable, unreasonable side as well, because when I read this, it reminded me a lot of Merleau-Ponty, who talks about objects in this way as inviting us to take them up in certain ways, to use them in certain ways, appealing to our appendages to grasp or to hold or whatever, and that's valid phenomenologically, from a phenomenological perspective. The way Merleau-Ponty used it, that is a valid way of talking about the world. The way that Bennett's trying to use it, on the other hand, is not valid, because she's trying to kind of pass it off as a metaphysical or ontological truth, as if the chips are inviting us to do things in the same way that a human would invite, trying to eliminate this distinction, as if, it's just like I say, just anthropomorphism through and through. But there's a kernel of truth there, which you can appeal to make this more reasonable. But really, that's not what the goal, that's not the aim here. Another thing that she says in this, to achieve this movement, this first movement I talked about, is to note that small things can have big impacts. Of course, undeniably true, right? Small objects can have big impacts, but that has nothing to do with agency. It has nothing to do with what we base our vertical hierarchy, where humans are up here as agents and inanimate objects are down here as passive things that we use. The fact that small things can have big impacts has absolutely no relevance when it comes to talking about agency or acting in any kind of capacity, which is agency, right? And another thing, there are a lot of semantic slides in the book, and I'll just give you a couple of examples. One is social, right? The word social. We all know what social means. Social means the interaction of typically human sentient beings, right? Interaction of sentient beings with other sentient beings. That's how we understand social. That's how society arises. But and maybe we could even extend that to down the animal kingdom. You might even go so far as to say ants have a society of sorts. You could probably get away with that. That's fine. Whatever. I mean, we know what social is. It's this kind of behavior amongst really living beings, right? But Bennett's redefinition of the word social is to mean acting on other things and capable of being acted on. Now, social applies to any and all objects, right? Now, you can have tables and chairs are engaged in society because they act on each other, they act on us, and we act on them. They're capable of being acted upon. So now we've got to extend this society, social, to inanimate objects. Just a completely unjustified and unreasonable redefinition. Impersonal life. That's another expression that she uses. Impersonal life. Just think about that for a minute. An impersonal life. How can you have an impersonal life? That doesn't even make sense. But once you throw these kind of terms out there, now we can talk about the life of metal. Now it makes sense because we've taken away the personal from life. Life doesn't have to apply to things that we can say have a personal aspect, have a personal dimension. Now, impersonal life makes sense. Now we can talk about the life of metal, the life of tables, the life of chairs. All of this stuff is now up for grabs. Just just unacceptable redefinitions, actually. I really don't like this when I see this in books, when I read this. It's the lowest form of philosophizing, I think. Redefining terms in a way that is solely trying to secure a goal that has no actual benefit in terms of furthering our understanding towards anything, that has just this political kind of agenda behind it. And that's all that there is here. It's a political agenda trying to achieve this first movement, elevating objects in the direction of agents. Another one, and this pervades the whole book, is the word actant. And she takes this up from Bruno Latour, but actant now is referring to the agency of things in assemblages. So now we're not even using the word agent, right? Because we know what agents are. Agents are essentially conscious beings. They're beings that can make plans. They're beings that can intend something, that can move towards a goal, that can deliberately act in the world to achieve some kind of goal. But that's not what inanimate objects are. We all know that. That's obvious. So it would be unreasonable to say inanimate objects are agents. Solution? Just get rid of the word. Let's throw a new word in there. Actant. Let's make up a word. Now, once you get rid of the word agency, which actually means something, and replace it with this nonsense word, now your political goal is a step closer to you, right? So I really don't like that word actant, but it's crucial, and it's in the quote I gave you at the beginning, the goal of the book, to find a more horizontal representation of the relation between human and non-human actants. You may not have even noticed it when I used it, but there it is. Not impressed with that at all. And the final thing I want to say regarding this first movement is she talks about so-called non-human objects playing a necessary role. And I guess I've already kind of mentioned this as well, but just on the basis of that they are necessary, that they're essential in everything, it's ridiculous to elevate them to bona fide members, to give them some kind of pseudo agency, to warrant the invention of a word, actant, to try and secure this. So that's the first movement, elevating objects in the direction of agents, trying to bring them into this realm, this category where they are agential, where they have some kind of capacity for agency. The second movement is the opposite. So it's diminishing actual agents in the direction of objects. So you can see now there's a pincer movement going on, right? The first movement elevates objects in the direction of agents. The second diminishes agents in the direction of objects. And so you meet in the middle, and that's the goal. That secures the ultimate goal of the book, right? So the second movement goes under the name human exceptionalism or anthropocentrism. Both expressions I really dislike. Human exceptionalism, I mean, as if there's something wrong with saying that humans are exceptional. We obviously are, you know. It just seems ridiculous to deny that that's the case. But there's this kind of PC-ism gone crazy where you're just not allowed to say it anymore. It's as if, you know, it was like as if it's akin to racism or sexism or something. We've just kind of taken it too far now. Now we're not even allowed to say humans are special, despite the fact that a human is so much more special than a table or a chair or any of these other non-human objects that Bennett references, or even many of the non-human animals right? It's speciesist to say that a human, to attribute more value or worth or whatever to a human being. There's a clear difference. And so, yeah, I don't like the word human exceptionalism, and I don't like the way that it's ever employed, which is always to try and pretend that humans are no different, or not essentially different from other animals, or in this case from tables and chairs, from inanimate objects, from metal, so yeah, just cannot get on board with this at all. But let's follow the pattern. Let's follow our path. Reasonable. How is this reasonable? What's the kernel of truth? Humans are assemblages of foreign objects. We are material configurations. True. How could you deny that? Right? We're not made of any special kind of conscious substance or anything. There's nothing special about the components of our bodies. We're just assembled of the same bits and pieces that every other object and every other animal on the planet is composed of. And also, we're not special, as in chosen by God or ensouled in some way. We don't have any kind of... We've well and truly gotten rid of that belief, which is exactly what we should have done. We should get rid of that belief. So that's the reasonable element to this movement, that we're not special because we're composed of some magical substance, or we're not special because we've been granted some kind of divine characteristics or any divine properties that make us special in any way. That's the reasonable. The unreasonable then is, as with the first movement, to carry it further, to go, therefore, humans aren't fully agential either. We're not real agents. We're just made of the same stuff as tables and chairs. How could you? Why would? How would you get an agent out of that? We're just the same. Just a different type of conglomeration of these same particles. Not different in essence. And that's the unreasonable. Quick discussion of this. So humans are assemblages. As I said in the reasonable section, no problems with that. But this doesn't make it impossible that we're also more than the sum of our parts. It's kind of easy to just throw this out there and say, yeah, humans are made up of the same atoms and molecules and things that every other object on the planet is made up of, or in the universe perhaps is made up of, but that denies an obvious truth, right? That's kind of, it's approaching reality without paying any attention to reality. It's approaching reality from a kind of blind theoretical standpoint. The only thing that exists is matter, therefore everything is just matter, everything's the same. That's what the theory tells us. But if you look around you, look at reality itself, that's clearly not an adequate explanation or understanding of the world that we live in. So there has to be more to it than that. Yes, we are assemblages of the same kinds of things that make up everything else, but this cannot be the last word on the story, because just look around you, look at you. Right? Are you the same as a table or a chair? Are you the same as your pet dog? Is there really no difference? No essential difference? Nothing that makes you fundamentally different from your pet? And of course there must be. I mean, the world around you is not a world for dogs. Right? Everything around us refers to us. We've created all of this, the framework in which we live, the structure of our civilizations, our societies, our cities. Everything refers back to us. we've done that. Dogs didn't do it. Elephants didn't do it. Even chimps didn't do it. Even the great apes, our closest cousins, they're still so far away from achieving even a fraction of what we have. So to deny that based on this claim that, well, we're all made up of the same things, right? We're just a collection of foreign objects, material configurations. It's blind, right? It's just ignoring the truths. It's ignoring the reality. And another thing she says in this vein is that humans are influenced by the food that we eat. Right? We typically think of our minds and our thoughts as this kind of rational capacity that we have as different from, removed from the lower base physical aspect of ourselves. But Bennett points out, we eat food, we eat certain kinds of food, we don't eat food. This affects our moods, it affects our behavior, it affects our thinking even, right? So even going to this sacred realm, this subjective mind, the physical can affect it. The food that we eat affects us, she says. And the implication is that, well, we're not the vaunted agents that we hold ourselves to be. Rather, we're just another part of the puzzle, just no different, not meaningfully special in any way, just another piece of the puzzle, like the food. The food affects us. We don't affect the food affects us in this far more profound way. But again, this doesn't diminish our agency. It doesn't make food an agent. It doesn't go even a tiny step in that direction. So those are the two movements that I think drive the whole book: elevating objects, inanimate objects, in the direction of agents, and diminishing actual agents in the direction of objects, and kind of meeting in the middle to secure that ultimate goal, to find a more horizontal representation of the relation between human and non-human actants. Okay, so that's kind of the overview of the book. The next section is, I think the most interesting. It was the most interesting to think about for me anyway, and we'll just jump into it, and then I'll explain it once we're in there. But I've called it the two fundamental errors. All right, so these two fundamental errors that I think underlie the whole book, and Bennett's reasoning throughout the book, are these. Well, the first of them is they're both confusions, they're both conflations between two different realms. The first one is a confusion of metaphysics or ontology, whatever word you want to use, but we're talking about fundamental reality itself as a whole. Confusion of that level, fundamental reality, with emergent phenomena in individuals within that whole. So those are the two realms that are being conflated. Fundamental reality as a whole, with individuals, emergent phenomena within individuals within that whole. And so we can see this, how this works, if we just break it down into both categories, look at both categories separately. So the metaphysical truth, the truth as it applies to fundamental reality itself. There are only assemblages. That is a metaphysical truth. That at the level of fundamental reality as a whole, the assemblage is the truth. The assemblage is prior to the parts that make it up. And so here we get things like, and here's the link to Bergson's bee caterpillar pairing. So in Creative Evolution, he talks about the way that we can't understand the bee and the caterpillar and the relationship that they have if we take them as individual separate objects and just try and kind of splice them together. We'll never understand how it is that the bee is able to, in this case it's sting the caterpillar and the precise number of times and the precise places that it has to in order to immobilize it. We'll never understand how that happens if we approach the bee and the caterpillar as separate entities, the way that, say, a third-person scientist, a third-person scientific account would. Because, the bee doesn't analyze the caterpillar the way that a human does, that a human scientist from a third-person perspective, from the outside looking in. There is rather this symbiotic fusion, if you like. The bee and the caterpillar aren't two separate things spliced together. They are a whole, a bee caterpillar. The assemblage is what is prior to the two individuals treated as separate things. And that's the metaphysical truth. Bennett does talk about Deleuze and Guattari's wasp-orchid pairing. So the wasp and the orchid can't be understood as, again, two separate things, but they have to be understood as this whole, a fundamental whole, prior to the breaking up into these two things. And so that's our lower order, fundamental, metaphysical description of reality. And that's correct, right? Bennett makes use of that. And then we also have an emergent truth. So the emergent truth is that these assemblages are meaningfully divided into separate individuals. So even though the whole is what is metaphysically prior, we can still talk about the bee and the caterpillar as separate, independent entities. We can still talk about the wasp and the orchid as separate things and identify different properties that they possess, even though the metaphysical truth is that they are a whole, an assemblage. The emergent truth is that we can divide these assemblages up and into separate individuals with higher order then features, things like agency, things like intentionality, just the different properties that we see from that we see in the individuals that make up, that nevertheless make up this the whole of the assemblages that we're talking about. So you've got those two realms, the metaphysical truth and the emergent truth. Both are true, right? It is true that at the metaphysical level, only assemblages are real. And it's also true that at the emergent level, the level of individuals, we have differences. We can see differences, it's meaningful to divide the whole into these separate individuals with differing properties that differ from other individuals in the whole and properties that differ from the whole itself. But what Bennett does is she leverages insights from the lower order metaphysical domain to draw conclusions about the higher order individual emergent realm. And that's the first error that underlies a lot of the reasoning in Bennett's book. This leveraging of insights from one order into the other illegitimately, and so we see it with agency, right? We see this is what Bennett does with agency. She notes that at the level of metaphysics, at the reality as a whole, there is no agency in parts. There is no agency in the individual parts. The agency is attributed to the whole. It must be, because the whole is prior. The whole is what is true at the metaphysical level. But then she takes that and applies it at the emergent level, the level of individuals, and says, well, as we already realized, we already discovered, there is no agency in the parts. The agency must belong to the whole. Therefore, humans aren't the only actors. Therefore, inanimate objects are just as important as animate objects, and blah, 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 right? And the error has been cemented. And an example I thought I came up with to try and show, it's a ridiculous example, but to try and show how this doesn't work, because when you read the book, it seems plausible, right? It seems to pass muster, but it's just due to the nature of the topic, of the things that she's talking about. The way I'm going to talk about it, it's obviously false, but the reason it's false is because of it's the same process that Bennett is doing. So the reason that it's false also applies back to Bennett's use of, or Bennett's misuse of this, or Bennett's confusion between these two levels. So my example is the wasp-orchid, going back to this wasp-orchid pairing. Metaphysically, there is only this whole. There is no individual wasp or individual orchid. It's the wasp-orchid together. Well, if we take this wasp-orchid pairing, clearly the whole has the capacity for flight, right? The wasp-orchid pair, taken as a unified whole, has the capacity for flight. Therefore, we can say orchids can fly. But we all know that orchids can't really fly, so we need to come up with another word, right? Because it's not going to do to just say orchids can fly. Obviously, that's false. Let's come up with a new word. Let's call it vicarious aviation. So orchids have the capacity for vicarious aviation. Now we've secured our goal of getting orchids to fly. Orchids are no different from wasps, and our political goal is achieved. That's exactly what Bennett has done with this word actant, right? Taken the metaphysical truth at the level of reality, fundamental reality as a whole. There is no individual agent. Agency can only be attributed to the whole. Therefore, at the level of individuals, we also have to say that there is no agency in the parts. Therefore, the human is not an agent in particular, special in any way from any of the other non-human objects. Therefore, we need a word that will sweep all of this under the rug. Let's come up with a new word. Get rid of agency. Actant is our new word. And that's exactly what Bennett has done. And that the parallel is my orchids flying through this fictional term, vicarious aviation. Interestingly, what science does is the exact opposite. Science tries to understand the whole, metaphysical reality at this fundamental level, by applying insights from the parts. So it goes from the emergent individuals and tries to draw conclusions about fundamental reality. Bennett is doing the exact opposite, trying to understand the parts, the emergent features that belong to the individuals, by applying insights gathered from the whole, from metaphysical reality. And my analogy here, to hopefully clarify that, is to imagine trying to understand Windows, the software, by dissecting the computer into parts, the hardware, by attacking the hardware. That's what science does. Tries to understand the software, Windows, by dissecting the hardware, the components of the computer. Whereas what Bennett's trying to do is to try and understand the parts, the individual pieces that make up the computer, the hardware, by analyzing Windows, the software. Neither of those approaches work because neither have respected that gap that lies between the two. You can't take truths from one domain and apply them at the level of the other domain. So we always have to remember that distinction between the parts and the whole, the individuals and the metaphysical reality. And the other era is very similar to this, actually. It is different, but it's similar. And it's a confusion of the micro with the macro. Confusion of basically physics with the everyday human world. So again, we can attack this the same way that we did the prior era, talking about each domain separately and then seeing how it's illegitimate to move from one to the other. So the micro truth is that matter is dynamic, right? Matter is alive, it's vibrant, hence the title of the book. Matter, if you once you get down to the smallest components, it's not static, it's not stationary, it's not dead. There's this buzz of activity. Matter at the smallest level is dynamic. True. And the macro truth, though, is that conglomerates of this matter, if we put together enough of these little dynamic pieces, we get something that is static, that is stationary. And so we have this distinction at the macro level, a meaningful distinction between living and non-living, dynamic and static, active and passive. This is not, it's not a fiction. This is a meaningful way of breaking up reality at the macro level, right? So we've got those two truths. The micro truth, matter is dynamic, and the macro truth, conglomerates of this matter can yield stationary, inert objects that are anything but dynamic. But what Bennett does is leverage insights from, in exactly the same way that we saw before, leveraging insights from the micro level and applying them at the macro level. So just because subatomic particles are dynamic, just because there's always this buzz of activity, this dance of subatomic particles, doesn't mean that conglomerates of them are also dynamic. Doesn't mean that we also have to treat every collection of these dynamic constituents of matter as being alive, as being active. There is a fundamental distinction. And it's interesting that we see this actually play out in quantum mechanics, right? Quantum mechanical characteristics don't manifest at macro levels. And by macro, we're just talking about certain molecules. Once you get to the size, I forget exactly how big it is, but once you get to, I think, like bigger than buckyballs, maybe there's this thing called buckyballs, a collection of atoms or a molecule of a certain size. Once you get to that level, we don't see quantum phenomena anymore. And so it just the things that we witness or that we interpret as happening at the quantum level, at the level of the very small, we don't see happening at the level of the very big, at the macro level. And so that's an exact, what is it? It's not a proof, but it's a proof of concept of what I'm talking about here, that it's illegitimate to draw conclusions about one realm from observations or theory that's taken from a different realm in terms of the macro and the micro. And because it wouldn't be right to leave this without an analogy, since I gave you an analogy for the last one, there's another analogy here in terms of the observer effect. Think of the observer effect at the quantum level, your observation. The Copenhagen interpretation is that your observation collapses the wave function, and the particle goes from being spread out in this diffuse state in which it's everywhere, but in different places with different probabilities, to being at this one particular point. That's what the observer effect is. Until you observe it, until you observe the particle, it's nowhere, and it doesn't have a speed. It doesn't have any attributes. Once you observe it, it kind of coalesces into a fixed point. Taking that micro truth and then expanding it or applying it to the level of the macro, then we get this nonsense claim that your thoughts create your reality. You can manifest something by just thinking about it. If you visualize $1 million in your bank account, the universe is going to, the wave function, the quantum, the Schrodinger wave is going to collapse somehow around your bank account in just the right way so that you have $1 million in there. That is a classic example of a classic analogy of how it doesn't make any sense to take insights from one level, the micro, and apply them at the level of the macro. Despite that, a lot of people apparently do believe that if you spend any time online. It's good. It goes by the name, by the way, quantum woo-woo. I really like that name. So so there's that. So those are the two fundamental errors that I see at play in a lot of the reasoning in vibrant matter. All right, the last section, I want to just go through some of my conclusions about the book. So I'm going to try not to belabor this section. I've kind of talked about all the important things I wanted to go over. Just want to go through and break down the things that I agree with Bennett about, and the things that I disagree with her about. So the first thing, the agree category. I agree with her metaphysical or ontological, whatever word you want to use, her picture of fundamental reality. Mechanism is not the final word on the universe. We need something like Bergson's élan vital, but this is not going to be a magical energy or a force or anything super added to the universe. Definitely not something like chi or prana or whatever word the kids are using these days that we can tap into or access or channel with our minds direct into our chakras or whatever. Nothing like that, nothing mystical, but mechanism cannot be the final word. There has to be more to the picture of fundamental reality. If you've seen any of my other videos, especially the ones about Bergson, you'll probably I don't need to say any more about that. And Bennett is right that matter is dynamic in the sense that it possesses an impetus characterized by opposing forces. So this is going beyond Bennett and back to Bergson, but she's right in the sense that matter is dynamic. and everything else I said there is going past Bennett back to Bergson. But the point is, she's right in this broad sense that there is a dynamism to matter, to reality, that is not captured in the mechanistic approach to reality. I even think that, and this is something I haven't really thought through, but science might implicitly rely on this impetus, something like the elan vital, possibly through working through the four fundamental forces. So I think there is some interesting thought to be done on that. Because it's fine to say that reality is grounded in these four fundamental forces, and that's the scientific picture. But why those four fundamental forces? What is it that makes those four fundamental forces, which are active, which are dynamic? What is it that makes them dynamic? Ultimately, you're going to come back to some kind of inherent, intrinsic dynamism in the universe. You're not going to be able to reduce everything to this kind of purely mechanistic, a purely mechanistic, static picture. That you're going to have to incorporate dynamism into your picture of reality, whether you're looking at it from philosophical or a scientific perspective. Either way, Bennett's right to say that matter is dynamic. It has this sense of dynamism that is perhaps de-emphasized in physics. She's also right, or I agree with her, that I think her pragmatic goals are to be commended. So she's trying to understand situations and events with a kind of a broader toolkit, instead of just restricting our focus to the humans who are acting in certain situations. It's right, I think, and it's commendable to try and step back and look at the other things that are going on, the other things that are perhaps causing us to act in certain ways, whether that be regulations or whether it be, other kinds of non-human object interference. That's all valid, and I talked about that with object-oriented ontology as well. That's a valuable. It's a valuable way of thinking about things. It's a worthwhile way of thinking about things. Just expands our perspective a bit. And I've got a reasonable quote from the book. I'm looking for a materialism in which matter is figured as a vitality at work both inside and outside of selves, and as a force to be reckoned with without being purposive in any strong sense. And so that's a fine quote, right? And if that was all that Bennett was arguing, I'd have absolutely no problem with anything. But it's the leveling down that really kind of gets my hackles up. That this urge to horizontalize, to raise the inanimate up towards agency, and to diminish actual agents down towards the level of the inanimate. And that brings me to the second section where I disagree with Bennett. So I'm totally opposed to her desire to horizontalize this. I cannot get behind this at all. To me, it's just PCism gone crazy. We've got to diminish, we've got to ignore the fact that we are agents, that we are genuine subjects, that we're different from other animals, that we're different from inanimate objects. We ought to be ashamed of our hubris to think that we're special in some way. I can't stand that. Humans are exceptional. We don't have to be ashamed about our human privilege. So humans are the only true agents. And this also holds for the at the level of living organisms. Living things are exceptional in relation to non-living matter. There is a significant, meaningful difference between those two categories. We don't have to be ashamed about our animate privilege either. Inanimate objects are tools. They're instruments which we appropriate, use, misuse, and their role is passive, not active. Just creating words like actant doesn't change any of that. And there is, and all that does is confuse the issue. It confuses. It doesn't shed any light. It doesn't further our understanding of anything to fudge over this meaningful distinction. And I'm going to call on Bergson here to refute this. He gives us a living universe. The universe as a whole endures for Bergson, but he does it without this urge to horizontalize, without this urge to make everything the same. He isn't afraid to say that humans are special in relation to other animals and plants, or that life is special in relation to inanimate matter. And that was more what I was hoping to get from Bennett when I read that she follows in the footsteps of Bergson in some way. But yeah, she just didn't go there. And finally, in relation to this, Bennett's desire to horizontalize. I've mentioned this already, but it's a separate point that I wanted to make. Trying to close the gap between humans and objects by raising objects and lowering humans only confuses the truth about the world and reality. So it's valid to create new words, to change meanings of old words, to use them take them up in different ways. It's valid when that. And I'm thinking of someone like Heidegger here, who's classic for this, right? Reusing old words, redefining old words, making up new words, Dasein. These are all, he's been criticized for this, but there are reasons for doing it. And it's not just, he doesn't just have a political goal. He's not trying to change our way of thinking about things. He's trying to enhance our understanding of reality. He's trying to clarify his position, not trying to sell us on an agenda. And that's the difference. That's what I see Bennett is doing here with all of her terms like actant, talking about impersonal life, and all of those other words and expressions that she uses. She talks of things as characters in a speculative onto story. They're things. They're not characters in an onto story. I mean, she talks about a gunpowder residue sampler as an object or a witness. Describes humans as walking, talking minerals. Doing this doesn't clarify anything. All it does is try to advance her political agenda, which is reduce humans to the state of objects and raise objects to the status of agents. So I really don't like that dimension of the book. And finally, the last thing that I want to say I disagree with in Vibrant Matter is that it's enough to understand the human constructed world through the actions of human beings, through our economic, our social, political, historical, all of those branches. That's enough for us to properly understand how the world is and how the world has gotten to where it is. We don't need to pretend that non-human objects are somehow active participants, no matter how important or necessary they may be in that role. It's enough to treat humans as the only agents, because in truth, we are the only agents. All right, summary. So first, the goal of the book was to find a more horizontal representation of the relation between human and non-human actants. And that is the whole, that's the agenda. It's a political one. She doesn't try and hide that, I think. She's quite open about it. It's clear that that's what she's doing. That goal was enacted in two movements. First, elevating objects in the direction of agents, and secondly, diminishing actual agents in the direction of objects. And that kind of, I called it a pincer movement. Once you do that, then you kind of level the playing field. Objects are then actors, and actual actors become objects, but they meet in the middle, if you know what I mean. Then we looked at two fundamental errors, and this was probably, for me anyway, the most interesting part of the video, looking at the confusions, I think, that underlie some of Bennett's reasoning. The first was this confusion of the metaphysical whole with emergent phenomena of the parts. And the second error was a confusion of the micro with the macro. And that these were different errors, but there are clear parallels between the two. The basic premise is you can't take insights from one realm and apply them in the other. But that's what I saw Bennett doing in several places in the book. Okay, and so that's me on Jane Bennett's Vibrant Matter. Not a lot of positives in there. I mean, I wouldn't recommend the book. I didn't get anything actually from it. I spent the whole book, the whole time I was reading it, just kind of foaming at the mouth in places and like underlining sections and making this video, planning this video. That was really all I was doing while I was reading it. I just didn't get anything from it. It's just not the way that I see reality at all. But it was interesting to think about. It's interesting to make this video, and I like that. Like I said, that third section, two fundamental errors. I think there's something interesting in that section at least. But I hope that video helped. I hope it clarified something or confirmed your own take on it, or perhaps that you disagreed with it and you've got now a whole lot of things to criticize in my criticism of Bennett. But thanks for watching as always, and we'll catch you in the next video.